he was so interested in Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. We're at the Apollo Theater, and the doorman came up to my room and said, there's a Luther Vandross who said he wants to be your fan club president.
Did he struggle with the idea of coming out publicly? Was that something that you talked about at all?
But he wasn't going to come out and say this to the world. And he had a lot of lady fans, and he told me that he just didn't want to upset the world.
So, Patti LaBelle has just confirmed some things about Luther Vandross and Clive Davis that the music industry has been sitting on until Clive's death.
Legendary music exec Clive Davis has died at the age of 94.
His family says he died from an age-related illness at his home in New York City.
And this is not just about Luther's sexuality. This is about what it cost him to hide it. What it cost him to be the most beloved romantic voice in R&B while never being able to say out loud who he was actually singing about. And then you find out who he signed with at the end of his career, and suddenly the whole story lands completely differently.
That I would open myself up to the possibility of a relationship based on the person and not on gender.
So what did Patti actually say, and what was really going on? Let's get into it. So on June 22nd of 2026, Clive Davis died at his home in Manhattan at the age of 94. The man who built half the music careers of the last 50 years was gone, and almost immediately, every conversation that had been quietly circling around him for years started bubbling back up to the surface, including the conversation about Luther Vandross.
Love has truly been good to me.
Because here's the thing about Luther that the industry knew and the public wasn't supposed to. The man who sang more convincingly about romantic love than almost anyone in the history of R&B was gay. He never said so publicly. He never confirmed or denied anything. But people who were close to him knew, people in the industry knew, and for decades, everyone just kept it moving. And the man who signed Luther at the most vulnerable point of his career, the man who walked Luther into his final album, was Clive Davis, whose own truth would not come out until 2013. We'll get back to that. But first, Luther. His best friend and collaborator Bruce Valanche told Out magazine in 2006 that Luther had once said to him, "Nobody knows I'm in the life." That was how he put it. He was deeply, carefully, intentionally in the closet. He had very few romantic relationships according to people who knew him closely. And the longest one he was known to have had was with a man in Los Angeles in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He never brought a partner to a public event, not once. He never confirmed or denied anything. When a Vibe reporter pressed him on the subject in 2001, he deflected with a joke about being bi-coastal. And then he said something more honest than most people caught at the time. He said he knew he was paying a price for being so private, and he wondered sometimes if it was worth it. Now, you have to understand what the stakes actually were for a man like Luther in that era. The 1980s and early 1990s R&B world was deeply embedded in Black church culture. The romantic male lead singing to women about love and devotion was the entire commercial premise of what Luther did. His fan base was almost entirely Black women who adored him as a romantic figure. Coming out would have meant dismantling the entire identity that his career was built on. And in a cultural environment that was genuinely hostile to openly gay Black men, the cost wasn't just commercial. It was personal. It was community. It was everything.
He told me that he just didn't want to upset the world.
He was known as he was a singer of love songs. And
yeah, but it was hard for him.
So Luther stayed quiet. He channeled every feeling he couldn't say out loud into his music. And for 40 years, it worked. The songs were honest in a way his public life could never be. You could hear it if you listened. He sang about longing and loss and the kind of love that swallows you whole. And not one person he was singing about ever got to be named. In 1985, a British music magazine published a story claiming that Luther's dramatic weight loss that year was due to AIDS. The story spread fast.
Everybody wants to attribute the weight loss to either being sick or something like that. I'm great.
This was the height of the AIDS crisis, when the disease was decimating the gay community and being connected to it publicly was career-ending in ways that are hard to fully convey now. Luther was furious. He sued for libel and went to every media outlet he could reach to shut the story down. He won, and in the process, he revealed the actual reason for his weight loss. He was in a new relationship. He didn't name who the relationship was with. He didn't say anything about its nature, just that he was happy, and it showed on his body. And then the subject was closed. But the episode revealed something about how the industry and the press were watching him. There was a constant low-level surveillance of Luther's personal life, a search for proof of something that everyone suspected, but nobody could confirm. The AIDS rumor wasn't a random guess. It was rooted in assumptions about his sexuality that had been circulating in industry circles for years, and the fact that he had to go on a media tour to fight off the suggestion of being gay, framed through the lens of a fatal disease, tells you everything you need to know about the environment he was operating in. And underneath all of this was another layer: the weight. Luther struggled with his weight his entire life, gaining and losing hundreds of pounds across multiple cycles. Eddie Murphy mocked him publicly. Cedric the Entertainer made jokes. The press covered every fluctuation like it was a news event. And while people treated it as a separate issue from his sexuality, it wasn't entirely. A lot of people who knew Luther believed the weight was connected to the same emotional suppression, the same inability to be fully himself, the same thing that made him say to Bruce Vilanch, "Nobody knows I'm in the life." There were other moments that gave the press ammunition. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Luther developed a reputation in the industry for being difficult. His perfectionism on tour was legendary. When En Vogue opened for him in 1993, the contract had clauses barring them from wearing certain colors that Luther's band wore: no reds, whites, blues, blacks, no sparkles either. When En Vogue tried to adjust their band's position on stage because audiences complained about sight lines, Luther refused.
You gotta be allowed your expression. You know what I'm saying? You don't tell Picasso not to use blue when he's in his blue period. You know what I'm saying? Picasso, why don't you try some purple? You know, why don't you try some red? You know what I'm saying? You just don't do that.
The situation escalated to the point where he called the police on En Vogue for stepping outside the boundaries he had installed. They eventually left the tour and spoke to the press about his behavior. Luther called them spoiled and non-truth-telling contract breakers. And earlier than that, there was Anita Baker. The two had agreed to perform a Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell duet live at the Grammys in 1987. They rehearsed. They had a plan. And on the day of the ceremony, Anita changed her mind and chose to do something else entirely, leaving Luther exposed. He lost his nomination that night too. So they ended up co-headlining a tour together called The Heat, with Luther having curtains installed backstage so he wouldn't have to see her. Security locked Anita's dressing room whenever Luther entered the building. None of this was about sexuality directly, but all of it was about control and isolation, which were the two things Luther returned to over and over throughout his career, both professionally and personally. The pattern of someone who couldn't be fully himself in the world outside, finding ways to enforce total control in the world he did have power over. In December 2017, 12 years after Luther's death, Patti LaBelle appeared on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen, and she confirmed it. She said Luther was gay. She said he had confided in her about why he never came out publicly. He didn't want to upset his mother. He wasn't sure his mother knew, even though Patti suspected she probably did. He had all these women who loved him as a romantic figure, and he didn't want to shatter that for them. And Patti said he told her he just didn't want to upset the world.
Did he struggle with the idea of coming out publicly? Was that something that you talked about at all?
We talked about it. It was basically he did not want his mother to be, although she might have known, but he wasn't going to come out and say this to the world.
Now the reaction was mixed. Some people felt she was just confirming what everyone had always known. Others felt it wasn't her place, that Luther had spent his entire life protecting that information, and it wasn't Patti's call to release it 12 years after he was gone. That debate is real, and there is no clean answer to it. What Patti also said was that she and Luther had a relationship that went back decades. He had been the president of her fan club as a teenager in the Bronx. He genuinely adored her, and she knew him well enough to understand what the hiding had cost him. When she talked about it on television, she wasn't being careless. She was telling the story of a man she loved, who had lived a life where being honest about himself would have meant losing everything he had built, and Patti would know more than most about what that kind of industry pressure looks like. She has been in this business since the 1960s. She has watched what happens to artists who don't play by the rules. She understood exactly what Luther had been navigating, and she said it plainly. It was hard for him. Now here is where the story gets a lot more complicated, because the man Luther ended up signing with near the end of his career was Clive Davis. And Clive Davis, it turns out, had been hiding something too. By 2000, Luther had been dropped from Epic Records after nearly 2 decades of success and a failed stint at Virgin Records. For the first time in his adult life, he was unsigned, and Clive Davis, who had just launched J Records after being forced out of Arista, came to him personally and told him he was the best male R&B singer in the world. Luther signed. What the public did not know at that time was that Clive Davis had been living a double life for over 20 years. He had been married twice. He had children. But since his time in the Studio 54 world of the late 1970s, Davis had also been exploring relationships with men. By 1990, he was in what he described, in his own words, as a monogamous relationship with a male doctor that lasted until 2004. He did not reveal any of this publicly until his 2013 autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, where he described himself as bisexual.
That I would open myself up to the possibility of a relationship based on the person and not on gender.
So think about what that moment actually was. The most closeted figure in R&B signing with the most closeted executive in the music industry. 2 men who had each spent their entire careers managing what the world was allowed to know about them. People who knew the industry during that period have said that Davis saw something familiar in Luther, that there was a recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to carry something private while performing a completely different version of yourself to the public every day. Now, some people have taken this further. There are those who have suggested that the relationship between Davis and the artists he brought close was not purely professional. Davis has faced allegations from multiple directions over the years about the way he exercised control over artists, his Grammy weekend gatherings, the access he offered and what he expected in return, his parties, the culture around him. Other artists have spoken about feeling pressure in their relationship with him that went beyond the music. Whether any of that directly touched Luther is not something that can be confirmed. What is confirmed is that 2 men with shared secrets found each other at the end of one of their careers, and that the album they made together became the most personal thing Luther ever recorded. What also gets overlooked in this conversation is how Davis operated more broadly with artists who came to him vulnerable. Luther was not the only one. The pattern of Davis identifying artists at their lowest point, offering them a lifeline, and then building relationships that gave him enormous leverage over their careers is something multiple people in the industry have spoken about over the years. The Grammy weekend parties that Davis hosted annually became one of the most talked about gatherings in music, not just because of who attended, but because of what the attendance was said to signal. Being close to Clive meant access. It also meant being inside a circle that operated by its own rules. And Luther, who spent decades hiding the most fundamental thing about himself while being extraordinarily successful, was in many ways the ideal candidate for that kind of dynamic. He needed a label. He needed someone who believed in him. He needed someone who understood what it was like to perform a public self that didn't fully match the private one. Clive Davis was all of those things at once. And the question of whether that understanding was purely compassionate or whether it came with a price attached is the one that people in the industry have been quietly asking ever since. The album Luther and Davis worked on together was called Dance with My Father. The title track, co-written with Richard Marx, was about losing his father when Luther was 8 years old, about wanting one more dance with the man he had been grieving for over 40 years. Luther's father had died suddenly in 1959. Luther was 8. He has said in interviews that he could never watch a father and son interact on screen without feeling that grief come back fresh, that wound never closed. And Dance with My Father was him finally putting it directly on the honest thing he had ever made. And it was also the last album he would complete. On April 16, 2003, while finishing the album in the studio, Luther suffered a massive stroke. He went into a coma for nearly 2 months. When he regained consciousness, his ability to speak and sing had been severely compromised. Dance with My Father was released in June 2003 while Luther was still recovering. It debuted at #1. It won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year and Song of the Year. Luther was not well enough to attend the ceremony. Richard Marx accepted the Song of the Year award for both of them and said from the stage that if Luther were there, he would be whispering about what everybody was wearing. The audience laughed because that was exactly who Luther was. Luther Vandross died on July 1st, 2005. He was 54 years old. He had never publicly acknowledged his sexuality. He had never confirmed or denied the rumors that had followed him for 2 decades. He gave the world some of the most beautiful romantic music ever made, and he did it while being unable to live that romance openly in his own life. The 2024 CNN documentary, Luther, Never Too Much, co-produced by Jamie Foxx, dealt with his sexuality honestly but carefully. Director Dawn Porter followed the lead of the people closest to him, acknowledging the reality without reducing him to it. What the documentary makes clear is that Luther's identity was not hidden in his art. A David Hockney painting of 2 men in a shower hung prominently in the foyer of his Beverly Hills mansion. His obsession with Diana Ross, the way he moved, the taste that ran through every single thing he touched. None of it was concealed. It was just never named out loud. And that is the thing that stays with you. The man spent his whole career singing about love in a way that moved millions of people. He understood love deeply. He felt it. He wrote about it with more specificity and more ache than almost anyone. And the industry that profited enormously from his ability to do all of that was the same industry that made it impossible for him to claim any of it. Patti LaBelle said he didn't want to upset the world. But here is the real question. What kind of world makes one of the greatest voices it has ever produced feel like the truth of who he is would be upsetting? Because that is not a Luther Vandross problem. That is a Clive Davis problem. That is an industry problem. That is a culture problem. And the people who ran that industry, including a man who was hiding his own truth at the same time, built the exact conditions that kept Luther in the closet for his entire life. He gave everything to the music, and the music gave back everything it could. But the love he was actually feeling, the life he was actually living, that never got to be public, that never got to be real in front of the world. And that is the part of Luther Vandross's story that nobody in the industry was ever going to tell you until Patti did. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.